Rustin was one of the most important social justice activists in the U.S. in the 20th century. He, as a teenager in Westchester, Pennsylvania, he stood up against racial segregation. He moved to New York in the late 1930s, joined the Communist Party for a while, got a sense of the injustices of capitalism. But basically then, in the 1940s, 50s, and into the 60s, made his home in the peace movement, in organizations like the Fellowship of Reconciliation and the War Resisters League, at a time not only when we were faced with a world war and a Cold War, but also when peace activists were coming to realize you can't have peace without racial justice. And in the 40s and 50s especially, Rustin pioneered in the use of Gandhian nonviolence as a way of calling attention to segregation and other forms of racism in the United States. So he organized a freedom ride in the 1940s, long before the freedom rides that many of us know about in the 1960s. In addition to his work against nuclear weapons, when the Montgomery bus boycott started at the end of 1955 and word traveled north that this was happening, Rustin, with 15 years of experience, breaking the law nonviolently, went down to Montgomery, Alabama, introduced himself to Dr. King, and began a process of mentoring and tutoring someone who was clearly destined to be a great leader, but tutoring him so that Gandhian nonviolence would become central to how Dr. King conducted these freedom struggles. Rustin wrote up the plans for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference with A. Philip Randolph. He organized events in Washington, D.C. in the 50s so that Dr. King would have a national platform. So that by 1963, when there was a convergence on this idea of let's finally march on Washington, Rustin was better prepared than anyone to be the organizer of that event.
Bayard Rustin being honored along with 15 others with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. What were your thoughts, and what do you think Bayard's would have been?
Well, I was tremendously happy. It's a great honor, and especially coming at this time just before the anniversary of the march. And of course, from the first African-American president. I mean, Bayard would have been delighted, and I think he would have actually be surprised that we have an African-American president so soon in our history after he died. All of what was known as the Big Six, the leaders of the Big Six civil rights organizations that issued the call for the march, Mr. Randolph, Roy Wilkins, Dr. King, John Lewis, Jim Farmer, Whitney Young, they've all received the Medal of Freedom. And Bayard was kind of this hidden seventh, if you will, kind of behind the scenes, pulling the strings and organizing with an awful lot of very dedicated volunteers. He didn't do it by himself.
I mean, it's amazing when you actually look at the Life magazine cover of the march. It wasn't Dr. King. It was A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin.
Correct, correct. I've heard it said, and that Dr. King gave a wonderful speech, but people really didn't even start recognizing the significance of the speech until a couple of years after it was given. Really, it was part of a day of many speeches.
I wanted to talk about the controversies around all of this. 3 weeks before the March on Washington, Senator Strom Thurmond, the South Carolina segregationist, publicly attacked Bayard Rustin on the floor of the Senate. He read reports of Rustin's arrest for homosexual behavior from a decade earlier. In this clip from the film Brother Outsider, Senator Thurmond accuses Rustin of immoral behavior. Rustin responds.
The article states that he was convicted in 1953 in Pasadena, California, of a morals charge. The words morals charge are true, but this is a clear-cut case of toning down the charge. The conviction was sex perversion.
The senator is not interested in me if I were a murderer, a thief, a liar, or a pervert. The senator is interested in attacking me because he is interested in destroying the movement. He will not get away with this.
That was Bayard Rustin himself responding to the segregationist Senator Strom Thurmond, Walter Nagel. Talk about what was so unusual about Bayard Rustin. He was open as a gay man from decades before, in the 1940s.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think really the main difference between somebody like Bayard Rustin and Senator Thurmond, Bayard came out of a tradition of authenticity, of openness. He was raised as a Quaker by his grandmother, and part of the Quaker values and tradition is, you know, being honest, searching for the truth, and not really having secrets. And I think, as we all know, Senator Thurmond had plenty of secrets of his own, but he was not quite so open about them.
But in fact, John D'Amelio, isn't it true that Bayard Rustin had to distance himself, or I should say Dr. King distanced himself from Bayard Rustin, though he relied on him as a trusty advisor because of his concern whether he was being described as a communist or a gay man?
Yes, at different points there was a distance between Dr. King and Bayard, but in different ways. I mean, Bayard himself was very aware that given social attitudes towards homosexuality and gay men and lesbians, he couldn't wear it on his sleeve. He couldn't, you know, be out there with a rainbow flag. This was before gay liberation. So Bayard himself was perfectly happy to keep this in the background and to move out of the way if that was going to be good for the movement. What made him unhappy and what made him feel like he had been done wrong was when people disavowed him. And there was a point in 1960 when Rustin and Mr. Randolph and Dr. King were part of organizing major demonstrations at the presidential conventions, Republicans and Democrats. And at that point, Representative Adam Clayton Powell from Harlem didn't like the fact that these radicals, someone like Bayard Rustin, was getting so much attention and moving into his sphere in the Democratic Party. And he put out the word to Dr. King that if you don't distance yourself from Bayard Rustin, I am going to claim that there is something going on between the two of you. And that scared Dr. King. And Bayard made the decision to resign from his position, but he also expected at that point that he would be defended. And when he wasn't defended, it was painful. It was very painful. And he spent a couple of years, mostly in the early 60s, mostly involved in the peace movement rather than in the civil rights movement because of that rupture. And it's the March on Washington that brought him back into the center of things.
Julian Bond, can you describe Bayard Rustin as an organizer and talk about these tensions as well?
Well, it was obvious that he was just superb at getting people together. You can't think of it. I could not think of anybody else who at the time would have stepped forward, taken hold of this March on Washington, pulled together all these hundreds of thousands of people, the buses, the trains. You know, I saw something just recently made 800,000 sandwiches. Imagine that. And it's all done at Bayard Rustin's desire. One thing I think we're not hearing about Bayard Rustin is his sense of humor. He once said that Dr. King couldn't bring vampires to a bloodbath. That was the kind of organizer Dr. King was not. But Bayard Rustin knew he was an organizer, and it was just wonderful at getting people to do things that they didn't think they could do or didn't know they wanted to do. He was just a great, great person.
Walter Nagel, there's a funny scene in Brother Insider when there is Bayard, it's 5:30 in the morning on the Mall, August 28th, 1963. All the press is around him, and of course there's no one there. This is very early in the morning. The press saying, so see, no one's here. It's 5:30 in the morning. And he said he took out a white piece of paper, a blank piece of paper that they couldn't see it was blank, and he looked at his clock. He said, no, everything is going according to plan right now. But he said he had no idea how many people would come.
Yes, that's true. That shows the kind of sense of humor that Bayard had. At that point, they weren't really sure. I mean, there was a press conference 10 days or so before, and he thought maybe 100,000 people. But of course, when you're out there and you're just surrounded by the people that have been working with you, I guess it got a little scary. But it wasn't long before suddenly throngs of people started pouring out of Penn Station, and buses started pulling up and parking. So they really got a strong sense, I think, probably by 8 or 9 a.m. that this was going to be something really big.
And then there was the union organizing after 1963, running the A. Philip Randolph Institute. Julian Bond, I wanted to ask you also about A. Philip Randolph, one of the great organizers of the 20th century. His protege was Bayard Rustin. And Bayard Rustin ran that institute, bringing together labor and civil rights, often unions referred to as racist.
It's interesting to me to hear Walter call A. Philip Randolph Mr. Randolph, and if I were to speak about him, I would call him Mr. Randolph. And when John Lewis agreed to censor his speech at the March on Washington, he said, I couldn't say no to Mr. Randolph, because all of us thought of him in that way and held him in such great concern about his dignity and so on. He was that kind of person. He was a perfect mentor for Bayard, somebody who could say, why don't you do this? Why don't you try this? Don't do that. Don't do this. Just a wonderful mentor for him, and a guy who helped shape his, I think, his political outlook. And, you know, for all of his life, Rustin was a great believer and defender in organized labor, and fought for it as much as he could. And it's a shame that we don't have someone like him now who is such a great spokesman for working people.
In his later years, gay rights was extremely important to Walter, I mean, throughout his life, but he actually started because of the movement that was growing around him, Walter.
Yes, he started speaking out about his own experiences as a gay man. And he was being invited to conferences and conventions by gay groups and being interviewed in the gay press. And so he was he was more comfortable, more open about who he was and what his experiences had been. I think he was a little surprised and delighted. I mean, at that point he was in his 60s, early 70s. And, you know, the gay movement, as I remember when it first started, it was really largely a movement of young people. So I think they were kind of seeing him as a senior figure, as an elder, if you will.
We just have 10 seconds, but A.J. Muste was another critical influence. A. Philip Randolph and A.J. Muste, John D'Amelio, if you could just summarize who this pacifist was.
A.J. Muste was one of the most important pacifists in the 20th century. He brought a sense that racial justice and world peace are interconnected, and so pacifists should fight against colonialism as well as against war. And he was a mentor to Bayard for quite a number of years.
We're going to